Okay. Welcome everyone. I am Bre Owens with Western Landowners Alliance. Really excited for the presentations and the conversation today on the Three Creeks project. My role at Western Landowners Alliance is as the stewardship coordinator. So essentially I serve to help create two-way conversations, getting resources to landowners that can benefit their stewardship, and also getting landowner voices and concerns back into conversations where they need to be represented. At WLA, we work to advance policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. So today, in part of our mission to deliver stories on good stewardship on the ground and help with peer-to-peer networking to advance stewardship, we're highlighting the Three Creeks project, and we have Kris Hulvey with us and Taylor Payne. And Taylor is the Northwest Region Grazing Improvement Program Coordinator for the Utah Department of Ag. And he is the I'm going to call you the champion, the chief champion of the Three Creeks project. And Kris Hulvey is with Working Lands Conservation. She's the founder and lead scientist of the organization. And I'm going to call her the chief scientist or chief researcher on the Three Creeks project. So we're really excited to have you both today sharing with us. This is a really unique project, but I'll let you guys share about that and take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Bre. Welcome, everybody. We're going to be talking a lot about Utah, and we are located up in the very far corner of the state, and so we're right in the corner where Wyoming and Idaho meet. And so anyway, we're glad to be able to have you today so that we can tell you about some fun things that we've been up to up this direction. We're just working on getting our screen to share so that we can present to you. And anyway, this is a project that I sure hope all of you can ask a lot of questions. And if you want to ask questions, we have a chat dialogue at the bottom of our screen that you can write a question on, and we'll be able to see the questions pop up and hopefully take care of answering as much as we can. So I'm a state employee. I work for the Department of Agriculture, and I specifically do grazing projects, and so I'm very busy in trying to coordinate with lots of people that are based in rural communities and all across northern Utah where I'm at. And anyway, this Three Creeks project that we're talking to you today has become a kind of a cool project that is totally novel. We know of other projects in the country that have bigger acreages, and there's other factors of projects that are similar. But today, when we talk, I guess some of the things that I want you to think about are we've not ever experienced another project that has the amount of different land ownership types and the amount of people involved while working on this working land. And so we'll be going through this today and sharing with you while I try to get my screen to keep advancing. There we go. All right. So yeah, I said that we are up in the very far corner of Utah, and so this project that we're working on is called the Three Creeks Grazing Allotment Consolidation. And this is a project. The landscape around us is just absolutely full of a sagebrush steppe community. We have a great big sagebrush sea. A lot of other areas of the country have big problems with pinyon juniper trees encroaching and other issues. But out here, we are really good at growing sagebrush. We don't have those kind of issues that other places do, like pinyon juniper trees or cheatgrass issues. We have an elevation between about 6,000 feet going up to about 8,000 feet on this project. And anyway, our growing season here where we're at, we have roughly 45 days of a frost-free period of time when we can grow And so we are an extremely cold climate, and we have lots of experience being really cold too. So we're good at that. We'll also be talking a little bit today about Deseret land and livestock that we've used as an example. And so we just wanted to reflect to you how close these two project areas are. And so this project, we have a current grazing that's occurring out on the land right now. We have 10 different allotments that make up this consolidation project, where we've looked across the landscape and we've made a way to figure out how to show all of them and be able to try and pull them all together. Some of these allotments, they have season-long grazing. Some allotments have uh, just a simple deferred grazing system. Some of them are single pastures, but they're used for a small amount of time with larger AUM numbers. And so we kind of run the gamut of different types of grazing systems that are involved. Inside of these black outlines and green outlines, there's about 38 different individuals, whether they're permittees or private landowners, that are all encompassed in this project that can run their livestock together. The green area on this map shows the areas where Forest Service allotments are at that we've encompassed in this project. And then we've also got these black areas that were managed by BLM agencies here. So we do have lots of private land. There's just shy of 30,000 acres of private land, and we also incorporate several sections of state-owned school trust lands. And across all of this area, what's commonly occurred since the time of the pioneers ever got to this valley, the livestock have ran from the valley bottoms, where you see the little label that says Randolph. There's great big huge meadows and valley bottoms where we cut hay and we feed hay all winter long, and so these cattle and sheep, they would typically follow the green up, working their way up, and as these animals were able to go up over time, most all of the standards and stipulations on the grazing permits that were involved, they were typically always met, and those objectives were usually always met. But the problem here is that all of the same livestock that went up following the green up, even if they were in a deferred system or some other grazing type, they always would have problems coming home, because the same livestock would be coming right back down the same drainages, heading back to the home ranches in the wintertime while they're being prepared to come back and feed. And so we were always missing our targets, our stubble height utilization, or our riparian health wasn't being met. And anyway, just lots of issues were there. And we came across this when we were first starting to plan this project. And a lot of times we look at this project, and a lot of these original allotments, they were set up with good intentions. They were set up back in the 60s, and they were taking groups of people who are running in common and trying their best to have, sometimes some pasture rotations and some deferments, or just trying to manage the forage and do the best they could. But we were still lacking a bunch of management techniques that could be making it possible, where we'd be able to do a lot better job at grazing this land. So that's been a big approach that we've been looking at. And so because of those problems that we've come across, again, we had some season-long grazing, and we have lots of live water on these allotments, and so because of the live water, that baited in a lot of our animals to stay along the riparian areas, where we saw lots of problems occur. We had lots of issues, and so we had poor water quality. We have several of our streams from these live waters they're on the naughty list in Utah, on the 303D list. We have impairments that are happening, and so a lot of it's based off of our grazing. A lot of other things that we had is that because of these allotments and the way they're set up, a lot of them never had any rest for regrowth, and These pastures were being used at the wrong time of year over and over again, and that was a great big problem that we were trying to address. And there was ideas. There's been the ideas of making water systems or maybe making more pastures. They've been around a long time, but a lot of times these groups of guys never had a good way to organize themselves, or they didn't have enough funds simply to be able to go in and think about or talk over a plan to take care of grazing distribution, or figure out how to incorporate rest back into this grazing system. And they all had their assignments every year. They all knew that they might have a stretch of fence that they're supposed to go and maintain and do good with. But things like that, where they might have an assignment to fix a certain amount of troughs or to fix a stretch of fence, a lot of times the grazing systems just were not being maintained like they should. And so social issues, they were a very prominent thing, where these guys were running in common, and these families were together, and they'd been together a long time, but the same issues had never been resolved. And so these issues were an every year thing, and it was always kind of hard to, you can fight with your neighbors but you're still never going to get rid of your neighbors. And so that was an annual thing. And so because of these issues, they had management problems, they had some maintenance issues, they had water quality issues. There was lots of things that were kind of knocking at the door of being able to really burden people and beat them down. We in 2001, we had a time when all of the grazing permits were supposed to be renewed with the federal agencies, and specifically with BLM. The grazing permits were being worked on to be renewed, and in 2001, anti-grazing groups appealed those grazing permit renewals, and a stay was issued where all of the livestock were not allowed to be turned on for a time. And so all of these ranchers that we're talking about today, they got together, and in our county, we started a coordinated resource management group. And that group started talking and figuring out, hey, what are these issues, and what are these appeals that are successfully getting to a point where stays are being issued from preventing livestock being turned out? How can we overcome these issues, and how can we be doing better? And so that's where permittees started reaching out and thinking beyond just our little valley for a little bit of help and figuring out what could be done, and how could we overcome these challenges, especially with being able to get our livestock back on the range that we rely on so much. And so in one of these meetings, there was an old state director from our Division of Wildlife Resources from the state. He was part of the coordinated resource management group. His name was Kevin Conway. And Kevin spent a bunch of time out with the managers there at Deseret Land and Livestock on the ranch. It's a big private owned land ranch that is about 10 miles south of where this Three Creeks project was. And Kevin was always out there. He was taking pictures and always looking at wildlife, and he had a good feel for how livestock were being managed and grazed, and he knew that the ranch was being successful with all of the different moving parts that they had to work with, and he understood that managed grazing, all of the benefits it had, but I guess he could also look at it and he'd say, man, there are so many things that just aren't happening up there at this area where these permits are being appealed, and where so many issues and headaches are being risen. And so he just saw that basically just what wasn't happening on that public owned land. And so to give you a perspective of what Kevin was looking at there at Deseret Land and Livestock to the south, compared to this area up north that we now call Three Creeks, the ecological types weren't too terribly different. Deseret Land and Livestock is actually a little bit drier than Three Creeks. Three Creeks does have more live water and more resources like water to be able to make some significant quick changes. And so just to show you a little comparative map of how they both look next to each other. In Deseret, they down there, they have the ability to be able to rotate herds of cattle between about 100 pastures. And one of their major things that they have is that they can rest about 20% of the entire ranch every year. So they can rest from grazing from during the growing season on 20%. I mean, that was a major thing to think about, and that's been a major successful point for them. Their herds of cattle, they have several herds of cattle, and they use their pastures for about 1 to 3 weeks. Just depends on how big a pasture is. And when you look at a picture of Deseret, this is just a portion of their pastures that they have to choose from, but this is what one herd of their cattle are able to look at for the number of pastures that they could rotate between in a given year. So this would be just a simple year's grazing plan. And anyway, and again, there's several more pastures that are not shown in blue, but just to show you the idea that they're rotating quite often and taking an adequate amount of forage for the needs of the livestock, but also leaving enough for all the wildlife and water quality and other watershed health purposes. And so that Kevin came back and he asked all those people there, this coordinated resource management group back in 2001, he says, everybody here, I want to know why the same form of management can't be done on public ground like we've seen successfully done down there at Deseret. And so, I guess the idea, all these guys are coming together and they're sitting in a big room, and honestly, when you get into this community, all these cowboys, they all kind of look at each other and they kind of hem and haw, and they kind of think of all the excuses of why Deseret can be successful. Deseret is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it's a ranch that they use to help make money, but they think that ranch has a budget that they've never even dreamt of, and so all the permittees kind of thought, there's no way we could do that. That's just impossible. I mean, that's cool that they can, but we're just a bunch of small guys. And then Kevin just quickly turned right back to him and said, damn it, that's not good enough. We own that land and we ought to be able to make that happen. That's always been a quote that's always been memorable to me. And that was kind of a good little spurring moment that Kevin gave to all those guys, saying that, hey, we can do better. We have the ability to do just as good. And so that's kind of with that attitude, that was kind of the start of a change that has been where we've come from in making this Three Creeks project. And so that's when we started having different guys. They started thinking on the back of the napkin idea. They started thinking, well, what allotments could be involved? They'd start thinking that, hey, we've got this allotment, we've got that allotment, we've got these other neighboring places. We already have lots of fences between them where we could make a pasture system work. And anyway, just lots of ideas were coming across, and that's kind of where it led to. And so that's where people like myself, we were able to step in. And so the grazing improvement program that I work for, that was kind of an essential role in being able to come in and assist these permittees to not be burdened by the thought of how are we ever going to be able to compete with somebody like Deseret. But instead, now we have somebody that can be a full-time employee that's state funded to be able to find funding and find assistance and partnerships and being able to find groups that'll work with us to be able to accomplish an idea to make a great big pasture system across all of the range that we've got. And so that's been something that's been a critical role so far, is that our grazing improvement program has been here from the very start of our project without any turnover and without any other issues, but we've become a liaison between ranchers and agency representatives that make so many big decisions. we are able to help understand what challenges are needing to be addressed and what kind of answers we can come up with to take care of things that we can help ranchers with. So that's been an important role. So we had to come up with some new ideas for the same old problems. We wanted to be able to demonstrate good land stewardship by switching to a rest rotational grazing. This Three Creeks will cover about 143,000 acres. Again, it's consolidating 10 allotments. There's multiple landowners, BLM, Forest Service, private landowners, and state lands. And that incorporates about 38 different individuals. When we originally started, we had cows, horses, and sheep. This Three Creeks project, we have since retired the original horse permits and converted them just into cattle AUMs. And our goals in this project were to make it possible to increase rest on our pastures over a period of time. We needed to be able to take care of our wildlife habitat in a better way on this public land. We were especially wanting to address our riparian areas and our water quality. And we also wanted to make sure and support our rural economy and take care of our ranchers and make sure that they're going to be successful too. We were wanting to be able to help them see a different way of doing things, but also not change their lifestyle. We wanted to make sure that Rich County was kept like Rich County wants to stay. And so we had to think about our plan development with our grazing and infrastructure, our monitoring, and then as well as all of our social changes. And so we want to move from here and talk about some of those things. It looks like we have a couple questions on our chat board, and some of the questions are going to be answered here shortly about how we got everybody on board. And then we also have, let's see, I guess that's our only question so far. So we'll go ahead and we'll keep going just a little bit. So when you ask a little bit about our animal management, what we're planning on doing, we have 3,200 head of cattle that are permitted to be across this area. And what we needed to do is figure out a way to consolidate them. So what we've decided to do is to have two different herds of 1,600 head of cows each. The reason we have two different herds is that people are coming off of their base ranches from different directions in the county. Most everybody is coming off of private lands that are down low, and some of them are just simply on the north side and some are on the south side. And so that's basically how we are going to make that division and make those two different herds. We also have 3 different bands of sheep that are running in high country, which is over on the left-hand side of this map, up in the mostly in the Forest Service areas. And we also do have permitted sheep that will run in the wintertime. Just a little over 19,000 AUMs total. And again, kind of copying what Deseret has done to the south, we're wanting to rest approximately 20% of this range every single year. And like with anything, we had to make sure that our principles of grazing management were taken care of time, timing, and intensity. We are always trying to make sure and balance out our plants and animals' needs and making sure that the range is taken care of, and as well as the animal nutrition and health and performance, so that they can make it successful for the ranchers that I work with. We also had tons and tons of infrastructure. All of the red lines on this map kind of represent a brand new pipeline that wasn't existing already. And so there's roughly 95 new miles of pipeline with about 150 sets of new water troughs along all of those pipelines. We have additional new fences, but we really didn't need too many new fences to be installed. I mean, we had about 25 miles of new fence, but comparing that to the area that we are covering, it wasn't too much of a big change. So anyway, we made lots of maps and we've made lots of plans, and we've been able to get lots of these things done already, and it's made a huge difference so far. because we've had to do a new permit renewal and change the grazing management type, as well as all of the accompanying infrastructure that we had to rely on, we had to do a new NEPA. Well, that's probably one of the biggest questions that I get asked a lot is just how on earth did you get NEPA done? NEPA a lot of times has become a dirty word, and we get frustrated because we want to do big things and we always want to be able to change things, but it's always hinges on being able to get NEPA done. And most people experience that it's years at a time before you can ever get NEPA accomplished. So because of that worry and that issue, we thought, hey, let's ask our through the FLIPMA process, the Federal Land Management Policy Act process, we, as a group of permittees, we organized them to ask our county commissioners to petition the BLM and Forest Service to initiate the NEPA process. And because they did that, that was done kind of following the FLIPMA process. We were able to immediately get NEPA started. We originally planned to have some private contractors help with doing NEPA, and they assisted us in a long ways. We have learned some lessons about that since, and even though we hired private contractors to do lots of our NEPA work, they did lots of great work, but when they would turn over portions of the draft NEPA, seems like a lot of times the BLM and Forest Service, who were acting as co-leads on the NEPA, they would go and rewrite it anyway. And so I do feel like we've spent a lot of money that wasn't necessary. And we have definitely learned some lessons by doing this novel project. But that was how we initiated our NEPA project, or our NEPA process. And we have since been able to have a successfully signed and completed EA. We did not need to do an EIS on this. And from here, I'd like to turn over time to Kris, and she'll talk about some of our monitoring.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. So I want to share some of the work, baseline ecological monitoring, that Working Lands Conservation has been involved with over the past couple of years. And as Taylor was just saying, the NEPA process was a pretty long process. It was initiated in 2011, and the EA was finally approved in 2018. So there's been a little bit of time, and the project hasn't been implemented yet. That's supposed to happen next year. So there's a long time that can be a little frustrating for especially the permittees who want to move forward with the project. But this has given us a really great chance to collect a lot of baseline data about current conditions across Three Creeks and understand what we think is going to happen by doing some baseline monitoring. And then we'll, of course, continue monitoring into the future after the new grazing plan is implemented. Thanks. And before I show you some of the monitoring we've been doing, I just want to give you, show a couple of pictures again of the landscape. So as Taylor was saying at the beginning of the webinar here, there is a lot of sagebrush up in the Three Creeks area. I've heard it called the rainforest of Utah. They get enough moisture and there's a lot of it. If you could forward. The streams are pretty small across the area. You can jump over a lot of these streams. But these streams, and like many arid rangelands, are really the arteries of these systems. So they're important for a bunch of wildlife habitat, fish habitat. The greater sage grouse use these areas for their young chicks. And as Taylor was saying, they also are used for water for the cattle. A lot of the infrastructure that's been going in has included water lines to pull cattle off some of these waterways, but we're not fencing off the waterways. So these areas are still going to be open to grazing, and we really want to make sure we have a handle on what the conditions are like pre and post switch. This is a picture of some of the conditions in one riparian area. So as Taylor was mentioning, sometimes those riparian areas can be pretty beat out. Sometimes the sage grouse and trout habitat is questionable, and the water quality across these areas hasn't always met the state and federal standards. And these are really some of the problems that we're hoping this new Three Creeks project is going to address. And the way we're thinking that the project's going to address them is changing the management. And two ways that the management is really going to be changed across this area is by changing the duration of cattle grazing, so the length of time cattle are on the range, and changing the timing, so when the cattle are on the range. And to give you an idea of how these two factors can be played with to change ecological conditions. So here's some figures of, just what it may look like with how cattle affect vegetation with different grazing durations. So you can imagine in a short grazing duration, cattle are on the landscape for not very long. And so after cattle leave, vegetation has a chance to recover. And you contrast that with long grazing duration, cattle just constantly are eating that vegetation, not much time to recover. With timing, when you graze can also affect what your landscape looks like. So if you graze early in the season, that grass, that vegetation might get knocked back, but when cattle are removed, that pasture, that area near a stream has a lot of time to recover. Alternatively, there's some benefits to late season grazing. If you hold off grazing, your pastures, your stream areas have a lot of time to develop vegetation, which could be beneficial for species like sage grouse. But then you're going to have cattle come in at the end of the season, and there's not going to be much chance for regrowth. So coming up with the right combination of these factors is really key in improving ecological conditions. And so how you put together these factors can really alter the disturbance regime across the whole area and affect regrowth and recovery of these systems. Okay, so a question that we're asking as we're doing this monitoring is, will this new grazing plan improve conditions across Three Creeks? And here are two pictures. One is taken from current Three Creeks, and one is over at Deseret, the private ranch that has the management similar to what Three Creeks is moving towards. And you can just visually see a difference along these creek areas. Now, I did pick these photographs, but they're not so different from what you would see. They're both taken in June. So the question is, are we going to be able to improve those conditions? And what Working Lands Conservation has been doing over the past 5 or so years is looking across the landscape. And we have this great natural experiment that's going on right now. So we have some areas that are being grazed for 4 months, so long duration. We have some great areas that are being grazed for shorter duration early, some areas for shorter duration late in the season. And then if we compare that to what's going on over at Deseret, we have areas that are grazed for very short times at variable times through the season. And so if you look at the map, we have all of these areas we can monitor and compare and really ask, are there differences between what we're seeing right now at Three Creeks and what we're seeing over at Deseret Land and Livestock? And does that give us an idea of what conditions on Three Creeks could be moving towards when we do this new Three Creeks grazing switch? Some of the things that we're currently monitoring, we're doing a lot of monitoring of vegetation. So we're looking at stubble height, perennial grass and perennial forb height and cover. And those things are important for both forage sustainability, but also for sage grouse habitat. We're looking at the amount of bare ground around stream areas, which affects erosion. We're looking at the amount of biomass produced in different areas and species composition. And I just want to point out that a lot of this monitoring is done very closely with our partners. So with UGIP, of course, also with the BLM, who is out there on these public lands doing a lot of their own monitoring using protocols like the AIM and the MIMS. What I've been able to do is work with those biologists to really figure out where some gaps could be in our knowledge and create protocols that are approved by the BLM, which fill in some of those holes so that we can get the best picture possible of what our landscapes look like. Okay, and so I want to show you some pictures of what we're seeing in the different grazing systems. Taylor, could you put up the next one too? So these are two pictures from Three Creeks in the early grazed areas and the late grazed areas to point out the grass on both of those pictures is pretty short. The late grazed areas has more bare ground, not as much time to recover late in the season here. And Taylor, could you put up the next two? And so this third picture here is a picture along stream over at Deseret in the time-controlled system. Again, the system that Three Creeks is moving towards. Much taller grass, no bare ground. And then the last picture is actually an exclosure over on Three Creeks. And you can see that the conditions in that exclosure don't look so different from the time-controlled grazing. Now, for those of you that like to see that kind of information in a graph, here's a graph of that same information. So what this is showing is stubble height across the grazing season, May through September. The green line is the exclosure. The blue line is the time-controlled system, like over at Deseret. And then the red, orange, and yellow are the 3 grazing systems at 3 creeks. And I want to point out a couple of takeaways that I see in this figure. So the first thing I notice is that, again, the stubble height in the time-controlled system is really similar to that in the exclosure. When we first added the exclosures into our monitoring, we were not expecting to find this. So that was pretty exciting to us. The second thing that we notice is that the 3 creek systems right now just have a lot smaller, shorter stubble height. And so what I take away from this slide is that with the switch over to the new 3 creeks grazing system, I'm pretty hopeful that with that switch, those stubble heights might start increasing to look something more like what we're currently seeing at Deseret. In addition to a bunch of vegetation monitoring, we're also doing water quality monitoring, again in partnership with the BLM and Department of Water Quality. We are looking at a whole bunch of metrics. We're looking at E. coli levels, which is a fecal bacteria that can affect human health. That is regulated by the state of Utah. We're also keeping tabs on a bunch of factors that can affect fish populations, so water temperature, pH, dissolved solids, dissolved oxygen. And what we're finding here, as with the vegetation indicators, is that it really looks that by managing grazing duration and timing through the new grazing system that's going to be implemented, that we're going to be able to control some of the water quality and improve the water quality on 3 creeks. I want to share some information just about E. coli because that's what we've done the most analysis on up to this point. But one really strong relationship we found is that E. coli is really tightly correlated with the movement of cows. So when cows are present, E. coli levels spike, often to levels that are beyond the regulated threshold put forth by the state of Utah. But when cows are removed from a pasture, the E. coli levels decline. And so what we're finding, if you can forward it, Taylor, is that really the length of time cattle are grazed in a pasture can control the amount of E. coli violations that these pastures are having. That's great because we're planning on shortening the duration in a lot of the pastures across 3 creeks. We're also finding that timing of grazing matters. We're finding that there's a seasonal pattern with E. coli, so that E. coli levels are just highest in midsummer. And that indicates that, well, if you graze in certain pastures early and late, you probably will not violate those E. coli thresholds. Inevitably, some pastures are going to have to be grazed midsummer, but if we shuffle those from year to year, it's better than having the same pasture violate water quality standards throughout an entire season. You can forward it, Taylor. So that was just a little bit of the monitoring that we've been doing over the past 5 years. That's really giving us a strong story of what could happen when we switch to this new grazing system. I want to just tell you a tiny bit about a project that is just developing right now. And I'm really excited about this project because as Working Lands Conservation has become more and more of a partner with the producers up at 3 Creeks, there's been more trust and more ideas going back and forth. And maybe a year and a half ago, Taylor approached me with the idea that the producers were interested in understanding a little bit more about soil carbon accumulation across this 3 Creeks project. And I think that is really exciting. So we started forming some partnerships with the NRCS and with another soil scientist that we hired into Working Lands Conservation to address this interest. Right now, over the past couple of years, there have been some rangeland carbon protocols that have been approved in the carbon markets, which lets switches in grazing practice that lead to carbon accumulation in soils be sold as offsets into the carbon markets, which can bring back revenues for the ranchers. Now, there's a lot of questions about these soil carbon markets, especially in arid systems like where we are in Utah. So we're doing a little bit of basic science to address some of those questions, but our ultimate goal is to create a carbon map pre-implementation and then follow that monitoring up over the years so that we can figure out if we can get some offsets sold into the market and bring revenues back to help with infrastructure changes across Three Creeks. Now, the real test, of course, is going to be what happens after the Three Creeks switch. All of our data is telling us that we can expect some good things, but we're going to continue to monitor through at least 2025, hopefully longer, and really see how these landscapes change. And I can turn it back over to you, Taylor, to talk about some of the producer perspectives.
Okay, so yeah, we've talked about a whole bunch of the history of the project, and we've talked about the NEPA process and the infrastructure, and then we've talked about the monitoring and the ecological side. So one of the biggest parts of this whole thing is, you know, this whole project is a social project. It's so involved with so many people, and that's a trick. That's a challenge. That's when most people always say, how on earth did you ever get so many people involved, and how did you get them to agree to work together? And so that's a little bit of a challenge, and it's where we want to go to next. And you know, I've used this slide so many times, but you know, I'm just another one of them. But lots of us managers, range people, we can write plans, we can monitor, we drive around in trucks, and we make lots of paperwork, and we do lots of stuff in an office and out in the field, but managing people is hard. I mean, it makes you feel just like Homer Simpson here some days when you're trying to figure out how to work with people. And so, good question. I mean, it is hard. So we're going to jump back a little bit in history and kind of go back to the start of talking to these guys all over again. I say guys, that I mean that with all of the families, the spouses together, and working on how to make a decision together. And so when we looked at these 10 different allotments that were being considered for how to have better management, all of the producers in those allotments, every one of them were apprehensive about the cost. They thought, you know, again, we brought up the idea of Deseret, but how on earth are we ever going to afford it? Some of them were worried about private property and how their embedded private companies that are owning some of the private lands on this ground, how would they be involved? How would they be affected? What would happen to them? You know, some of the people were thinking, you know, how on earth are we going to manage to move our livestock herds that many more times in a year? And how are we going to have enough riders? And so, you know, the whole gamut. I'm only giving you a few examples, but so what we did is we went through our budgets when we talked about cost. We asked about any other proposals or any other thoughts of how are we going to address our issues of permits that are appealed, and how are we going to overcome a lot of the challenges that do need to be addressed. You know, we asked those producers, how else can we do some of these fixes? And at the end of all of this, what we did is we asked each of the producers that we were talking with to have a vote. And that was kind of the easiest way to be able to get everybody being able to be able to have their say. You know, every time I talk to the group of people, myself and with the other people that I work with, we said, now I want it all out on the line. I do not want to go to the coffee shop tomorrow and hear all of the horror stories and have all of the questions that were never asked or brought up because we were too shy. I said, we need to make sure we spill the beans here and let's get it out and open. Anyway, so after all of that, we took a go or no go vote with what we did is we divided everybody up with their AUMs and whatever somebody owned, using that against the total. That was kind of how we were going to proceed. And so we took the first vote, and we had a 92.5% positive vote with all sorts of apprehension. I mean, that was basically just to say, hey, should we continue planning? And then when we had the original or the final vote saying, hey, all right, now this is when we're going to initiate and start NEPA. This does change every one of your grazing permits, and this is going to initiate getting this big project going. And there was 2 people originally that voted no, and only one of those guys voted no the second time. So then we got a 95% positive vote to go for it, to change NEPA. Originally, the BLM and Forest Service, they said, hey, we'll do it as long as you get at least a 75% positive vote. So that's what we did. And since then, the last remaining person that voted no on the second vote, that ranch owner has passed away, and his family has taken it over, and they have totally come around to the idea of needing to do something more positive. And so we have 100% go from all 38 different individuals who are willing to be part of this project and to manage across the landscape together. And so what we have done is by changing, the human dynamics and the social parts of this, is we have now created a business structure where all of the permittees or the individual owners, we've created an LLC that they are all they own shares of the company that are reflected by the original number of AUMs that they brought in. And so that's how the company has been created. And so now the project also has contracted labor. You remember me in the past, we were talking about some of our neighbor issues. It's hard. You might have a group of guys who are good at going out and fixing their fence every year or taking care of troughs, and then you have some that just are horrible at it. So you can either have a war and continue that for the rest of your life, or what we've done is we again copied what Deseret did to the south, and we've started using contracted labor, and it has been an absolute world of change. We are already doing that, whether we're fully implemented or not. We have fence contractors, we have 3 hired full-time riders, and we've also contracted out all of our water distribution and maintenance for people, making sure that every bit of our water infrastructure is working how it should be, so that it doesn't give us any problems. So we formed that LLC, and we made sure that we had to have some rules that we all had to follow. We had to have teeth in those bylaws. And so that LLC is how the BLM and Forest Service recognize this group of permittees anymore. There is no longer an individual permittee. It is all run through that company, who has a board of directors who make the final decisions day to day. Whenever the big decisions are made or need to be decided on, we do still meet as a company, and we vote according to the number of AUMs or the number of shares that you own in the company, and that's how we decide big issues. And so, as I said, all 38 different individuals are all together now. The last remaining people who voted no, again, they saw the light, but if they didn't, sometimes this is a question, if those original people didn't participate in the overall project, they would still be assigned a range improvement project every year, but they would still have to follow the same grazing plan that all the rest of the members would have, but they wouldn't have the value of the cost share participation and the lower assessment fees that we were able to have. So anyway, that's the difference, and that's kind of what happened, and it's great to be able to have all of the permittees on board. So we did have a little bit of a history too. There was a subset, a little smaller portion of the Three Creeks area that we originally formed an LLC for to take care of some issues with BLM and Forest Service grazing permits, and from this original LLC that was called New Canyon, we were able to operate that group as one permittee, just like I was saying that all of Three Creeks has become. But this original New Canyon LLC, this was the original LLC that we started with. And then when Three Creeks was ready, we just added more members to this original LLC and then changed the name to the Three Creeks Grazing LLC. But I guess going back, it was a little bit of a blessing that there was 19 guys in this subset of area that they had to work together and they had to operate as one. And it was kind of a good thing that it happened, because they they all saw that nothing changed with their grazing and their annual cycle of calf production. It was just basically a difference in paperwork, and they saw that was beneficial, and we were able to get out of a bunch of issues and problems that arose, and so that was a little bit of a precursor to the bigger LLC that we have now, and anyway, so it did help us, even though it was a headache from the agencies, trying to figure out how we can solve some of our issues. From the get-go, we've really been trying to figure out good ways to never lose momentum. Kris mentioned how darn long it took to get our NEPA done. We were originally promised that we'd have it done in 2.5 years, and we look back and we think, holy cow, that was so long ago, and so many people have changed at the agencies that those people who originally gave us those promises, that was 6 range cons ago in each agency. And, so it was always hard, but by doing maintenance and rebuilding some of the existing projects that we did not have to have NEPA for, that showed a lot of the permittees that we meant business, that the grazing improvement program was there, the partners were there, the funding was available, that they're not just going into this thing with good hopes, but we made sure that it wasn't going to fail. And so we've had fence maintenance now for about 7 years, and there is no longer issues. I don't get calls from the agency range cons saying that there's problems with cows being where they're not supposed to be. We have our riders that are more accountable. The animals are supposed to be where they're at, and they're following the plans of how our annual grazing is supposed to happen. Our water systems are only improve just constantly. It is so cool, such a blessing this year. We have a terrible drought just like everybody else, and we're suffering through it just like everybody else, but it has been one heck of a year to put our water system to the test, and it has been just so neat to be able to see that our troughs are full of water. I mean, yeah, sometimes we have a little issue with valves, or we have a float problem just like anybody else, but we have water, and that's keeping us out on the range, and so that's been an awesome thing. And our guys all the time, they'll see me at the coffee shop or at church on Sunday, and every one of them close their eyes and shake their head and just say, oh my gosh, if we hadn't have done this long ago, I don't know where we'd be. And so by having these contractors and having these things that have happened with maintenance, our work is being accomplished, and our problems are being solved and getting so much better. And so that helped keep our momentum going. When we originally talked about this LLC with all of the participants, we originally estimated that each permittee, their AUM cost would go up by about $1.77. And we thought that would be a cost that we could spread out over a 12-year loan that we could get through the Department of Agriculture. And so that was our first draft idea. And so we've created budgets that the LLC operates on now. I help make their budgets, all the grazing budgets. They were items that any of the small groups and individuals never did have before, but now we have specific budgets that are showing our cost per AUM broken down by exactly what individual items are I guess just basically how much they cost, and so we've got great budgets, and now we are operating a good grazing company. We've changed the tradition of just going up there and being individuals to now being able to support this company and making sure that it's successful. So far, we've spent well over $5 million on infrastructure, and most of that funding has been state funding for this project in support of this grazing system. We have had federal funds as well, and they've been very, very beneficial to us. One of our very good beneficiaries, or funders, I should say, has been the Grazing Improvement Program, as well as the Division of Water Quality. They've supported us from the very get-go, wanting to be able to change our water quality and make improvements, and so a lot of times the producers in this group, they're always asking and they're wanting to know, hey, has there been any increase in AUM fees at all? And what's a little bit hard is I have tried to put together what they used to spend, but there's never been a budget from the very get-go. No one ever wrote down an expense. It was basically just, an expense is wrote out of the checkbook from the ranch account, and that was as good as we got. And so that's been a little bit of a hard question. I honestly feel like we are at least no more than was ever spent. I do think that we have decreased cost per AUM by spreading it out across the company members, but we don't have an exact dollar amount, but I do not think that we've spent any more money than what was originally estimated. So that's been a success. Go ahead, Kris.
All right. So yeah, I've talked about the ecological monitoring, and another piece of this that Working Lands Conservation is doing is making sure that we're hearing from the producers about whether this project is meeting their needs and what they're hoping for out of this. So we're doing a little bit of social science work. And I can imagine some of the risks that I think folks are taking by joining potentially this project, or they might think they're taking, and some of the benefits, but we really want to make sure we hear from the producers. And so we have been doing, and have planned a series of surveys and interviews to try to capture all of those thoughts. So we have a pre-implementation survey that we've already conducted, and I want to show you a couple of results of what we're hearing from the producers, and we're going to do the same survey a couple of years down the road when the project's been in motion for a while and people start seeing some of the effects on the landscapes and possibly their pocketbooks. We're also going to follow that up with some interviews and do an economic analysis. So Taylor was talking about the budgets. We're going to do tracking of those budgets, see how they change over the years. We might try to do a little digging backwards, and for any of the producers that do have records, take a look at those and see if we can just cobble together some before-after data too. So in these pre-implementation surveys, the goal of it really was to understand the producer expectations of the Three Creeks project and determine whether the project is reaching the goals that they want to see happen from being a part of this project. So far, we've had an 80% response rate to that survey, which is pretty good. And I just want to share with you some of the questions we've asked and the responses that we've been getting. So one of the big questions is, what benefits do you expect from being a part of the Three Creeks project? And what we're hearing is that about 60% of respondents are really hoping that there's an economic benefit that's going to come out of the project. And specifically, they give examples of things like increased calf weights, increased time out on the public land range. So earlier turnout dates, later bring home dates, increases in cattle health, also more funds for infrastructure that now they're going to, the water lines that are being put in, the fences that need patched. So more funds available for those kinds of maintenance costs. We're also hearing some responses that people think that being a part of the Three Creeks project could reduce the threat of litigation, which again would ensure that cattle aren't pulled from these public landscapes and can facilitate, maintain people's way of life in this area. Some people are interested in seeing if the project is going to improve ecological conditions. And then of course, there's a group of people that are waiting to see. Now, while a lot of the respondents are really hoping that they're going to have some economic stability that comes out of this project, one of the questions we asked also was, how will the implementation affect your operations expenses? And about 78% of folks think that their expenses are actually going to increase. And so while they're hoping for economic stability, they think that this project is going to be more expensive for their pocketbook. Interestingly, following that question with another question about, will this extra cost be worth it if you see improvements in the ecological conditions like water quality, conditions like sage grouse habitat? For both of those, over 50% say yes, even if we have to pay a little bit more, seeing those improvements on the landscape are going to be worth it. And so I think these are just, starting to drill down into people's really complex ideas of what this project means to them and what they're hoping to get out of it. And I think the post-implementation surveys are going to reveal more about that, see how people's views change over time, and the interviews will let us have real discussions to get more information on some of those topics. And just all of this information is being shared with all of the partners. So all of the ecological monitoring, all of the social science feedback we're getting is shared in the LLC meetings, also during field tours, during community forums like the CRM meetings, shared with one-on-one meetings with the BLM, the Forest Service, UGEP, the Division of Water Quality. And the goal is to use all of this information both to manage adaptively if we need to do that and make some changes along the way. Also, all of the data is available to the LLC in case of litigation. So there was a question that came up about collaborative monitoring with the producers. And I'd say that the monitoring that we are doing at Working Lands Conservation is not per se that we're not in the field with the producers doing the monitoring. They do their own monitoring as well. And what we can do is provide an independent source of data collection. And that kind of data is also important for litigation. So we have a lot of different data streams that are coming in about conditions out there on the ground.
So wanted to talk a little bit again about project funding. I mentioned it just recently. Most of our funds have been from state sources. That has been the majority. Then it goes into federal sources, and so our own grazing improvement program, we are able to have legislative funds straight from the state, which is an awesome thing to be able to support our grazing industry across Utah. We've had others, specifically the Watershed Restoration Initiative and the water quality. Kris has had several awesome research grants that we're able to provide a lot of this data collection and summaries with. And then BLM and Forest Service, they've both been able to provide some funding for different projects or other research as well. There was one economic analysis that was done by a economist over at Utah State University. And what we did is took a study of our current as-is grazing practices out on the Three Creeks area. So we thought that we calculated it contributes about $2 million. Multiplier effects increase that contribution to about $3.2 million, or 6% of our county's economy. And so I guess going in through all of this is basically we're just wanting to always emphasize, and any time that we do a presentation to anybody, is just that if we can improve this is as is, and we know that we're going to just make it that much better, and we're going to try and make sure that we have a shored up grazing system that makes sure that these local ranchers and our rural economy, our rural communities we are so centered around grazing, and now we need to make sure that we center it around good management. But we always say that good grazing management has a large effect in rural communities and in our rural economies. And so this is something that we want to do after we switch again, is have another economic analysis and see where we're at differently. But we're already, this one project alone, 6% of our county's economy. And I think that's an important factor to think about. I mean, we're small. Our county only has 2,500 full-time residents, but that's a major deal when it comes to our little community. So thinking and talking about our future. So, I mean, as we speak, I mean, literally right now, that same exact dozer operator is putting in another pipeline. And so as soon as this is done, I'm heading back up to go put in more troughs and rip in more line with them. And so we're wrapping up the very last portions of this. And so we plan to graze as a consolidated herd next year. And all of the cows, we're going to have tags given to all of the permittees, and all of the cows are going to have either one color or the other, depending on which herd they're in. And then all of the sheep are also going to be out on the Three Creeks area. And so we're having that complementary grazing going like we've always planned to have. It is later than we've ever wished it was. It's been a terribly long process. I wish it could have been shorter, but Kris is going to also continue her monitoring, and it's going to be cool to be able to tell this story. We would love to be able to come back to you in the future and tell you what we've learned. Maybe we've had some fun surprises. Maybe we'll have some bad surprises. I hope not, but we want to be able to share our experiences with this novel project. To kind of show you in an outline, just a real quick, simple summary. Again, back in 2001, when the permits were appealed, that was the spark of our idea, where that coordinated resource management was established, the idea of needing to do something, going into all sorts of plans and working with partners with the grazing improvement program and all of the ranchers. We took votes and we figured out how to make that happen. We changed the business management with making an LLC. We finally got NEPA done and got an EA with a signed decision. We've been putting in our infrastructure over a long darn time with all of our pasture fences and water lines and troughs and then our data. We've been collecting data for so long, it's been fun to be able to tell that full story. And so next year will be implementation, and we're going to just keep adding to this timeline with hopefully maybe ecological thresholds. Maybe that could be a good plan or a good goal, right, Kris? We can put a year on there when we think that we've done something really awesome with our riparians first, probably, and then work our way from there. And so all of this stuff, I did this for my master's degree years ago, and I've used this slide 1,000 times over, but this whole entire thing, we've always wanted to make sure, since it is a novel project and there's not anything like it with the number of landowners and the number of people involved, we've wanted this to be like a big cookbook for things that we've learned, things that we've battled through, ways that we would do it different next time. We've wanted to be able to make this cookbook that other people can learn from too. And so luckily my wife made me a good Betty Crocker cookbook slide to make this point come across. Some other thoughts that I've thought about and learned from is that, I get approached a lot about how Three Creeks was a collaboration. And I've thought back and I thought, sometimes I don't know that Three Creeks was ever sold, especially to the ranchers, as a collaboration. I don't mean that we don't collaborate, but sometimes the idea of collaboration, I think we've had a little different view on that here in Three Creeks than what other people think of it as. Again, we work with lots of different groups, and we have different funding partners, and different people have different ideas and objectives of what we want to be able to see out on the land. But we collaborate when we need to, but we don't collaborate with people who are totally negative the whole time on this. We work through the issues and collaborate with those who can have a good answer for finding a good solution. We've been able to give lots of tours, and we've been able to build lots of support from different groups, from business chambers, Chamber of Commerce. We've done wildlife groups and range management groups, and just so many different people. It's been fun to be able to get lots of ideas coming in and think about our future challenges. When we did need to work with interested public or those who brought challenges through the NEPA process, we worked through the NEPA process. If there was ideas out there that were negative against grazing management or wildly different than what we were hoping to do, we just basically did it through NEPA, and we never had any settlements taken care of, and we didn't have any other I guess big battles that we had to fight through. We tried to just get our homework done from the very start and do the best that we could. A big thing that we've also have kind of battled with lately is getting through all of our water rights updating. It wasn't that we didn't have the water rights. We had more water rights than we needed, but we just needed to have addressed some of them differently. And so that was a big thing that we've learned from. And so far, even without the full switch, I know that our county's economy has been strengthened already. I think that we're updating and protecting our watershed and our values for our wildlife through this grazing system. We're helping a lot of our producers update their grazing management with up-to-date range science and things that we know are better. We're helping, and I think we're being good partners with the agencies to try to help them out too. Sometimes we've wondered whether or not we've reversed an ecological threshold that we hope we don't go to, negatively. And, I don't know the answer of that. It's just totally a question that we like to think back and wonder about. We'd love to be able to take some questions and comments. Maybe we better go up to our question box first. And if that's okay, Kris, help me out here when I need some help, and I'll answer some where I can. And we'll start with Catherine. And she says, are bulls with the herds? And everyone always wants their bulls on their cows. And was that a conversation? Absolutely, it was a conversation. One thing that has been different here is that most all of these individuals that we've worked with have already been together. And so they've always had to have a kind of a bull committee or a bull selection process so that they didn't have bulls that they didn't want. And we did write bull selection and other issues that dealt with that in our bylaws. We do have some purebred producers who simply hold their animals out later and let their cows get bred by their own bulls first, and then they run more cows in place of the AUMs that they have. Anyway, they run more cows for less time instead of more cows for longer time, just so that their own cows can be bred by their own bulls and keep their own program going. I think Kris answered the question earlier from Peter Donovan about permittees participating in monitoring, and they're always able to go and participate. And I think that they really appreciate when Kris comes in and gives a Cliff Notes version at the LLC meeting. How about that? Sometimes it's an issue of time, just whether or not they're able to have the ability to go through all of the data and all of the time that it takes.
And one thing we definitely always make a point of is inviting people out to the field, to come out with my field crew, to see what we're doing, how we're measuring the range, and to make a meeting with me at any point if they want to talk about what I'm seeing out there, the data we're collecting. I have a lot of meetings with managers. So the BLM, I sit in the BLM's offices or on a Skype call, a Zoom call, 10, 20 times a year. So a lot of the data is shared as it's coming in.
Another question is from Lawrence. And he asks, are you going to increase the number of pastures in Three Creeks? And yes, we are increasing the number of pastures in Three Creeks. We will have a total of about 33 pastures that the cattle will rotate between. And that is an increase from what the original allotments had. You remember me saying some of them only had a single pasture. Some of them had 5 or 6 pastures that they deferred, rotated between. So now we're going to have 33 that we'll be able to have as individual pastures, and all of the water available for a herd of 1,600 head of cows. And so that's how we're kind of copying what Deseret did. Rick Danver asked, does the board of directors determine bull types, breeding, and calving dates for the LLC members? So yes, again, we do have the board of directors kind of oversees the bull selection and making sure that the committee is there to make sure that bulls are all right and that we don't have old bulls that we don't want. We do talk about open cows and health issues like brucellosis and Bangs vaccinations and everything else. But one of the big things that is decided as a full LLC group is when bulls are turned out. We have our heavy winters that we worry about, and so we don't want our bulls out too early. This year we pushed back our bull turnout days by 5 more days, and so they did not enter the cows until about June 20th this year. And so yes, the board of directors do have a big influence on that. Alyssa Florak asked, with 100% participation, what incentivized the ranchers to take part? I think one of the biggest incentivizing things to take part is that our ranchers experienced in the past all of the time and money that it took to work with attorneys to get through appeals processes when their permit renewals were appealed the last time. And that was probably one of the biggest sticks that drove a great big project like this.
Can I jump in, Taylor?
Mm-hmm.
We asked a similar question on the survey, and some other answers were avoiding lawsuits, like you were saying, to make sure that grazing wasn't taken off these allotments again. Also, just realization that neighbors were interested in moving forward with the project. So there's an idea that if my neighbors are going to join, I should probably join too and not stand in the way.
Yep. There's another question from Rick Danver. It says, would this project have happened without UGIP? And again, UGIP stands for the Grazing Improvement Program. That's what I'm an employee of. So through that leadership of the director that I had, they made it possible for me and my family to be able to live here in Randolph, where I have been able to be part of this project from the very start, where we had state government support from the governor's office all the way down when we had any issues that we needed to accomplish or resolve. We had funding. We had, I've been here again from the start to finish, and that has been a major a benefit, where we've had just an incredible amount of turnover from federal agencies. Because of that turnover, it has made it hard, but the consistency of my position and the consistency from Kris and the permittees, that's what has made this whole project get over the hurdle, where one person doesn't drop the ball and forget what happened from before. So I do think that the Grazing Improvement Program has been a major part in helping get this project done.
I could take this next question from Zachary.
Okay.
So would riparian pastures improve water quality and protect the creeks running through the pastures, or do the riders sufficiently regulate that cattle's access to the creeks? You know, one of the goals of the project, and Taylor jump in, is not to fence the creeks off. You know, by adding all the water infrastructure, there have been a lot of troughs that have been added away from the streams that are going to help pull some of that cattle pressure off the streams. And so we're thinking that with the timing and the duration and the rest that we're giving to some of the pastures, even allowing the cattle to have access to the streams during the time they're in the pasture, we're going to see a ton of improvement in those areas. It's something we're definitely going to watch, and there are potentially other management options, but we think that the timing and duration is going to go a long way towards solving that problem.
These questions keep jumping. I keep trying to stay organized. Hey, Kris, there's another question from West Lambert saying, are you seeing a change in species diversity with the changes in management? Can you answer that?
Yeah, I can. And we've been tracking species diversity right along the riparian corridor, and then just outside of the riparian corridor as well. And again, the change hasn't happened, but we've been using the natural experiment of different grazing systems across this area to do an initial look at that. And we're not finding any strong patterns right now with what's species composition in relation to current and historical grazing system. It is something we're going to continue to monitor as the grazing systems change across the whole area.
There's a couple questions from Lawrence Gallegos. One of them is, are you using Farm Bill programs or the NRCS to help with the infrastructure improvements? So I work out of an NRCS office, even as a state employee. And that would be a great idea. Like Sage Grouse Initiative has this written all over it. I wish that we could use it more. It has been an issue with being able to get all of the participants eligible to use Farm Bill programs. And because of it being such a large group and then having to have all of the sub-entities eligible, that has been a major undertaking where it has been so nice that the state funding that we've received has been able to step up and take care of a lot of the funding worries that we've had. And you know, I need to make sure and always remind you that our own permittees in this project, they also participate a great deal with their own funds as well through their assessments that come in through the LLC. So then another question from Rick Danver is, he says, do you think consolidating livestock herds rather than just subdividing pastures is a beneficial way to provide timing while not building barriers to big game movement? I think having the pastures is going to be an important role. I think what we have had GPS cow collars on these livestock that have been on both Three Creeks and on Deseret, and it shows that I guess the distribution, it absolutely changes as long as we move to different new pastures. And so our riparian health and our watershed health greatly improves. But the amount of time that cattle spend on a riparian when they're in a pasture really isn't that much different. But we're finally taking the amount of time and the duration that it's spent. That's what changes and makes a big amount of difference. And so Rick was asking whether or not having all of the barriers preventing big game movement might be a detriment. And, you know, I hope it's not. One thing that we've done is we have made a lot of letdown fences so that the barriers are hopefully reduced so that we can mitigate against that issue. And besides other livestock friendly type fencing for other big game species. And so I hope that big game movements isn't hindered anymore, specifically because of the letdown fences that we're doing where most of our big game movements are occurring.
Taylor, can you reframe that?
Sure.
I'm not sure what the echo is from. Wondering if you had chosen a pathway of dividing each existing allotment into additional, if you had chosen to start or change the grazing management by dividing each existing allotment into multiple pastures to get the same ability to influence timing and duration of grazing on smaller scales across the whole project, rather than consolidating the herds, what would, so you mentioned that you are putting in about 25 miles of additional fencing to implement the project. To do that across each allotment separately and maintaining individual herds, do you have an idea of how many miles of fence line would have needed to be put on the ground by going that route instead of the herd consolidation?
So just a close guess, I dare say we'd have to build 100 new miles of fences if we divided the existing little allotments into smaller pastures. But another thing is I don't think that we would have the ability to easily rest as much pasture or as much of the range as we plan to do. The other thing is just the water amounts that we have to be able to share. You know, we're coming from different sources of water, and sometimes we have a good source, and sometimes these allotments have had a little poor water amounts, and so we're sharing water through pipelines from other places that they used to have never had, and so we're spreading water around. And anyway, it was just easier to look at the bigger picture instead of trying to make a bunch of little pastures to rotate between. I mean, I do get the idea of what you're getting, but I hope we're at least on the right path of how we planned it. So but I do think that we would have had significantly more fence if we just subdivided the existing smaller allotments.
Yeah, it seems like more fencing, like you said, struggle with water across, also potentially the value of the impact that can be created strategically by those large herds. So you're getting multiple benefits out of that consolidation that would not have been able to be achieved by just changing grazing management within the individual allotments or producers' livestock.
And we already have increased management, but I think even more little pastures and a small allotment with fewer guys being able to help would have caused a greater problem too, for a social impact.
And I think ecologically, combining all of those allotments into, you know, 2 large land masses just gives you a lot more flexibility to make decisions ecologically about which pastures need to be rested. Maybe it's because they have an ecological feature that shouldn't be grazed near at a certain time of the year, so you can avoid that pasture. If you keep the allotments really small, you lose that kind of flexibility.
Yeah. So West Lambert also had a similar question. I think we hopefully answered. We'll go back down to Lawrence Gallegos. During the NEPA process, did you have to have a grazing plan that you want to implement? So yes, we always had a proposed grazing plan that we were hoping to do. But while we were working through the NEPA process, each of the individual allotments operated like they always did in the past with their deferred grazing plan or you know, just basically what was already there. So that was basically what we did there. Kris, do you want to answer Ann Neville's question about, is water quality being measured in this watershed? Are any streams gauged?
Yes. So working in conservation, we don't have gauges on the streams. We do instantaneous discharge. So we take those measurements twice a month from May through October. There might be a couple of different groups. Maybe the BLM has gauges on a couple of streams. Yep, but mostly we're doing instantaneous discharge, which gives us an idea of the amount of water moving through the watershed.
And then, thanks, Kris. Going back up to the top, a question from Willard Heck says, are there specific management actions to benefit sage grouse in light of their status as a species of concern? So we've done some mitigating things like fence markers, and there's been lots of plans though. You know, I guess when we think about Deseret and Three Creeks, there's a lot of similar habitat types, and there's here in this corner of the state, this is where we have the majority of sage grouse compared to other areas in Utah. And we always, I guess some of the research that is being done right now, we have found that there are more nest initiations and more chicks that have been hatched per nest initiations. However, Deseret has had a higher success of successful brood rearing than Three Creeks. Sorry, I'm trying to keep it all straight. But anyway, so we've been able to have lots and lots of research done through Utah State, where we're luckily close to the university, and lots of research that's been taken care of, and so I guess another thing that I always think about is where we have livestock centered in specific pastures at any given time, whether it's sage grouse or any other type of wildlife, we have different opportunities and different abilities for wildlife to go to any type of nutritional need that they need on the landscape, whether it's tall grasses and forbs, or you know, we can have livestock move to any sort of area where that forage and any other vegetation it would be in any, or at different forms of growth at any stage of life. And so I do think that you know, for brood rearing, that's an important thing. We have the cover that we need to for sage grouse here on Three Creeks that you know, that we know is necessary. And so we always have different management ideas and conversations going on, and we're definitely worried about sage grouse concerns.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because we are at time, but I just want to say thank you so much to Taylor and Kris for sharing today. Really inspirational, really exciting. And we all certainly, I think, are looking forward to seeing the outcomes of this, having future conversations with you both. If folks do have additional questions, please feel free to email them, and we can put you in touch with Taylor and Kris. And if there's any other, you know, items that just folks are interested in discussing further, please let us know. With that, we'll wrap it up. And again, just thank you so much for your time, and thanks everybody for joining us.